She'd kept a journal for her imaginary son for 15 years. Pained, I found it on her nightstand, next to a framed photo of a little boy who never existed. This was Eleanor Vance, a quiet woman in her 50s who lived alone in a corner house on Birchwood Lane. The case wasn't about a murder or a theft, at least not in the conventional sense. It was about the systematic, patient theft of an entire life. It began, as these things often do, with something small. A neighbor, Linda Peterson, reported someone had been tending the garden at the vacant house next door, not just weeding, planting new flowers, arranging decorative stones. The house had been empty for 6 months after old Mr. Henderson passed. We checked it out thinking it was kids or maybe a relative. The back garden was immaculate. Tulips in perfect rows, fresh mulch, a little painted birdhouse. It was peaceful, but it felt off, like a stage set. That's when I first saw Eleanor. She was in her own garden across the fence, pruning roses. She smiled, a gentle, shy thing, said she just hated seeing a garden go to waste. It seemed benign, almost charitable. We thanked her and left a card with the property manager. A week later, Linda called again. Now there were curtains in the upstairs window of the vacant house. She was certain they hadn't been there before. We went back. The front door was still locked, the manager's seal intact, but through the front window you could see them, lace curtains, hung perfectly. Inside, the place was spotless. Floors vacuumed, surfaces dusted, a vase of fresh daisies on the mantel. It was like someone was living there, but without any of the mess of living. We staked it out. 2 nights later, just after midnight, Eleanor emerged from the side gate of her own property, crossed the 2 yards, and used a key to let herself into the Henderson house. She moved with a quiet, purposeful familiarity. We watched through the windows as she dusted already cleaned shelves, rearranged cushions on the sofa, and then sat in an armchair for nearly an hour, just looking around. When we approached her inside, she wasn't startled. She just looked up and said, "I was just airing the place out for when Robert gets home." Robert was Mr. Henderson's son, who lived overseas. She said it with such calm conviction that for a second I doubted our files. But Robert Henderson hadn't visited in over a decade. We brought her in for questioning. That's when the story began to unravel, or rather, when her story began to replace reality. She spoke of Robert as if he were a dear friend, detailing his work as a botanist, his love for classical music, how he'd asked her to keep an eye on the place. None of it matched the man we contacted, who was an investment banker in Singapore and hadn't spoken to Eleanor Vance in his life. We thought it was a simple case of trespassing, maybe a lonely woman fantasizing. Then we got the search warrant for her home. Her house was a mirror of the one she'd been tending, impeccably clean, orderly to the point of austerity. But in the second bedroom, that's where we found it. It was a boy's room, a twin bed with a spaceship comforter, shelves of books appropriate for a 10-year-old, a desk with school textbooks, dated from about 15 years prior. The drawers were filled with clothes in a child's size, and on the nightstand, the journal. It was leather-bound, worn from use. The first entry was dated 15 years ago. "Dear Diary, Robert Jr. took his first steps today. He stumbled right into the azalea bush and laughed so hard." Page after page, year after year, documenting the life of a child. His first day of school, his chicken pox, his soccer games, his good grades, his teenage rebellion. The entries continued up to the present, describing a young man away at college who called her every Sunday. The handwriting never changed. It was all her, disgusted. But the real psychological twist came when we tracked down the real history. Eleanor had lived on Birchwood Lane for 20 years. She had been married briefly, a union that ended not in divorce, but in tragedy. Her husband and infant son were killed by a drunk driver while she was at work. The son's name was Robert. After that, Eleanor, she never moved. She never remarried. And somehow, in her grief, she began reconstructing a life around the empty spaces. First, it was her own home, maintaining a shrine to a son who never grew up. Then it expanded outward. The vacant house became the home of the grown-up Robert, the successful botanist's son she imagined. She was caring for the family she should have had. It wasn't malicious. That was the most unsettling part. There was no intent to harm, no anger, no typical criminal pathology. Pained. She was building a world to live in, because the real one had become uninhabitable. The Hendersons, when they understood, were horrified, but also profoundly disturbed. They didn't press charges for the trespassing. They just sold the house immediately. The law had no real place for Eleanor. She was evaluated, deemed a danger to no one but herself, and released with a mandate for continued therapy. But here's what stays with me. What makes this a case study in psychological crime? The damage was in the reflection she held up to everyone else. Linda Peterson, the neighbor who reported her, moved within a year. She told me she could no longer look at her own family, her own children, without a shudder of dread. The simple act of seeing Eleanor water her roses in the evening became a terrifying reminder of how fragile a mind can be, how close any of us might be to building our own fictions. Eleanor still lives on Birchwood Lane. The new neighbors know nothing. They see a nice, quiet, older woman who keeps to herself. They have no idea that in her mind the house next door is occupied by a loving son, or that the child's room in her home is waiting for a boy who will never come home. She's still tending both gardens. The crime wasn't what she did to a property. It was the silent, screaming evidence of a mind